We should start. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Game face. Welcome to a Monday morning primary source live stream. I am joined today by the Dr. Ben Franklin, and we're here to discuss episode 5 of Apple TV Plus's Franklin, starring Michael Douglas. Sorry, I forgot the name of the show. It's named after you. How are you doing this morning, sir?
Excessively well. Good morning, ladies, gentlemen. Excessively pleased to have this conversation with you.
This episode had a lot in it. There are previous episodes we were talking about, like there wasn't a ton of momentum apparent, and this episode had quite a fair bit of action and a good amount of your personal history to discuss.
It did. I know not if it's just me. This show seems to take fairly gargantuan chronological leaps, or at least it seems to my own estimation. We were only just celebrating the victory at Saratoga. Suddenly, John Adams comes in, and then with one great exhalation, it's July of 1778, and I found myself winking at it, wondering, what did we miss? We missed something in the scope of this, and I know not if it's because we are barreling inevitably towards Yorktown and finally the Treaty of Paris, and there is so much to cover in a show that can only devote so much time to a period of 6 years. But this one felt stark. It felt suddenly like we were tiptoeing through 1776, and then with a great discharge of a cannon, we were in July of 1778. And of course, I think it requisite and necessary to show the tensions of Mr. Adams, but it was a stark thing. I found myself suddenly having to read it several times to determine when we were. Then again, I'm always determining when I am. I'm a podcaster in 2024. But it was a substantial episode, to say the least.
Now, is there any in the interim time? Did the show brush over anything that you would consider very important?
Statecraft and the
State.
like, the establishment of collaborating and working with Mr. Adams. I think the show arrived at frustrations that have long steeped between myself and Mr. Adams. But of course, there's the transition of power. There is Silas Dean eventually removing himself. So I can wager it's safe at this point that we will not see Mr. Dean's involvement in the scope of the series, which might be for the best.
Well, if Silas Dean ever manages to travel to
Don't-
the present time, I won't
this
tell
is
him you
this
said
is the
that.
moment. This is the moment where you say, "Well, Dr. Franklin, we have a surprise guest today. And it's Silas Dean
We got-
with a chair."
Yeah, you wouldn't be aware of this show, but there was a show called Maury, which was famous for these kinds of appearances. Being like, well, it turns out we have the mistress right here. It would have been a
Silas-
nightmare for you to appear on, to be honest.
Silas Dean, you are not the founding father.
No. That's very funny. But there was it was an interesting exploration of Mr. Adams, as far as I felt it leaning very much into his puritanism, his puritanical, it almost felt a caricature of a New England Puritan in how he was verbalized. Was that true to life? Did you find him kind of buttoned up and in that manner?
I think the whole continent of North America did. But I think what is missing, Mr. Adams is coming off the heels of several great accomplishments, which is he was alongside his cousin Samuel, who was significantly more so, a New England firebrand in the advocation for American independence. And I think that reserved nature is not something we would see if we were on the other side of the Atlantic, but I think is requisite for France because it does demonstrate that Mr. Adams did not play the game, the careful French game. Mr. Adams swipes away the chessboard and insists on something more simple, less equitable, or
Right.
more equitable, perhaps. Um, but he did not take to France. He did not take to French custom. He did not take to the French court, and was a man of specific business. I think it's curious in the scope of any historic recreation because unlike other genres, foreshadowing takes place that will never be covered in the show specifically,
Hmm.
but must be shown for those who are acquainted with the history. So
Sure.
Mr. Adams, when he returns and begins American statecraft in the federal government, this is somewhat after my time, is regarded in his factional leadings to be more Anglophilic and more distrustful of the French. His policies as president of the United States will tend to favor England and even go so far as to become embroiled in what's called a quasi war with France.
Hmm.
I think we begin to see some of these prejudices and even to some extent the currying of favor towards British leanings with Dr. Bancroft,
Hmm.
even to the point of almost not undermining the American cause, but undermining the French Franco-American cause.
Hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting uh, way to put it. It seems as if they're trying to distill the entire character of personhood of John Adams, of his entire life, everything that he's accomplished, into what the version of him that we're seeing right now. Although I think
Well, and he has his own miniseries. He can stay out of mine.
I do think you're after that he doesn't play the game is pretty is correct, and that the filmmakers did it was a funny shot when they're in the discussing how much France is willing to commit militarily, like the newest ledgers. In the background of one of the shots of Dr. Adams, the chessboard that has been used in the previous
Hmm,
episodes is there, and it is not being the game is in its starting positions, meaning a game. There is no
interesting.
game being played. Uh,
Fascinating. I did not see that, but a keen eye, sir.
it's a having gone to I went to film school, and the things that you end up watching movies is not what most people end up looking at when they're watching films. But I thought it was pretty interesting scene, in particular that the brashness of him it threatens to derail everything, and I think his question at the end of that when they're waiting to get picked up from Versailles, the to Dr. Franklin is were the French moved by this farce of infirmity, right? Your gout suddenly had a flare up at the most opportune moment to stop an argument from taking place, and got some new uniforms and things. And I think it's an acknowledgement that John Adams doesn't have any appreciation for that pageantry, like, which I find interesting, given he wanted the president, when eventually they're talking about the Constitution in the future, to have a very royal name.
You're
Curious about that.
you're correct. Mr. Adams' version of monarchy is not palatable to French monarchy.
Right.
Uh, I think Mr. Adams, it was not his brush with power that made him bristle, but rather his brush with coy opulence.
Hmm.
Uh, Mr. Adams is a man of plain speaking. Mr. Adams boasted himself above all things a farmer before a lawyer. He is remarked and is regarded to get elbows deep in the manure that he's crafting for his livestock. He is the most likely puritanical in the classic sense, the most puritanical
Hmm.
of this sort of pantheon of founding fathers. And so it is curious that it's not the brush with power that makes Mr. Adams balk, but rather instead with the pageantry
Hmm.
that he has no place for.
Hmm.
But I think you see it demonstrated quite well. You see it, we're meeting a different aspect of Franklin in every episode, and I think you see in this one the acutely self-aware, charmingly self-deprecating and aggressively uh, senile Franklin, in the sense of disarming individuals. You see Franklin very effectively disarm people without conflict. You see it in his flare up of gout, and you see it remarkably well in the satirical approach he takes discussing the invasion of England.
Oh, that is a great and interesting. So, for those who haven't seen the episode, the Marquis de Lafayette makes his triumphant return to France as an American hero to his friend and proposes invading England with a detachment of about a couple thousand troops. So small, essentially like pirate raiding is what they're talking about. But they're talking about sacking cities like Liverpool and Cork and things. And he's the Marquis and Temple are presenting this plan to John Adams, Bancroft, and Franklin, and Franklin is all he. You had did John Adams consider the was the criticism valid that he didn't feel there was enough virility in your diplomacy? Like that's what he wanted. He wanted movement. He wanted action.
I think that is accurate. I think that there was a supreme amount of frustration with Mr. Adams that I was so comfortable at table and so demure
Mm.
in business. Um, you know, something we haven't seen in the series to this point was how careless I was with letters, with correspondence, with secrets.
Mm.
Um, and I think that the laissez-faire attitude in which I approach, which proved very effective, was frustrating for those who felt the stakes were too high to spend time doing this, that I was living far too well and far too comfortably
Mm.
while American soldiers were fighting and dying. There's a wonderful line that Mr. Douglas Franklin has when the words of the Declaration of Independence were cited by Temple,
Mm-hmm.
that yes, we signed it, and then we went home comfortably to our beds. It speaks to the awareness of the privileged position that Franklin certainly was in, but even more American congressmen at the time were in. And so I think for Mr. Adams, there was an awareness of the stakes, of the inability to play a game, to set a more important American precedent.
Mm. That's interesting. That scene, that moment after the conversation you're referencing, where Michael Douglas Franklin is talking to Temple, was interesting to me for another reason, and I'm curious to get your opinion on it because it felt as if the character of Franklin was drawn in two different directions. In one side of things, he says, Temple, you can't go on this military escapade because, and one of the reasons he states is that the Marquis family has for 1,000 years made business of war, right? That's what they do. They go to war. They lead armies. And the Franklins are craftsmen. They work with their hands. They aren't soldiers. But at the same time, he wants Temple to marry up. There was a interesting tension between the concept of upward mobility and family lineage and sort of rigid class structures that I'm curious to know what your opinion on is, because they were playing with a couple different things.
So the marriage is a fictitious arrangement,
Sure.
of course, but drawn from fact in the scope of Temple's father. And this is where it becomes truly interesting. Temple's father, William, has, of course, questionable parentage,
Yeah.
illegitimate parentage. This follows him over the course of his life, despite my efforts to legitimize him and bring him up to the best of my ability, and in him finding a great helpmate in my innovations of science experiments and compatriot in many other vices. But William, Temple's father, married high above his station, elevated himself allowing himself to climb to the social ranks that he did.
Yeah, for those who
He
don't know,
got
he was
quite
royal governor of New Jersey for a time. He was,
he developed quite a taste for that opulence. He left behind the sort of plain dealing teachings that I endeavored to instill in him. And so it's curious because you do see the dichotomy. I worked towards that once before, and well, I will not say it did not work out in my favor, but it led Temple's father down a very different path.
hmm.
Uh, the endeavor to do something similar with Temple to rear him as a plain dealing man of letters who might make his own destiny was a similar effort with William. Perhaps in this instance to do it correctly.
Hmm.
This time um, under a French banner.
Sure.
Um, I think there's a degree of insurance that comes with it. I'm old. I say as much in the series. Even at this point, I'm acknowledging my time is limited.
Hmm.
I'll even make response for this 10 years from when this episode takes place, 9 or 10 years, that I should have died several years prior, but I'm pleased that I remained to proceed over certain great events. So I know my time is limited. Temple's is just beginning. And there's a degree of security that comes from being taken care of
Hmm.
and being in France. If our business should miscarry, matters little to me. I'm old. Matters everything for Temple.
Sure.
Uh, so there's a degree of insurance that comes with it, of tying these families together, and selfishly also, from the fictional standpoint that it takes place, guaranteeing a certain depth and degree of proximity to certain individuals
Hmm.
within the pageantry.
Right.
I say in that scene as well, I make equal remark that I want a young man by my bedside when I die. A young person. I forget the exact line. And you must wonder in that moment, as Mr. Douglas is Franklin, does he truly intend Temple in that summation? Or
Right.
does he wish for a closer proximity to other
Hmm. That's an
individuals?
interesting thought. I'm curious. I wish we could both be questioning Michael Douglas's version of this character because he seems
I
to have gone through a couple of things that you don't have any recollection of.
I'm waiting for the response to his invitation, but I sent it by the 18th century post, so it may not get to him in time.
Well, hopefully we'll be waiting with bated breath. He can join us. But speaking of mortality, there's an interesting dynamic that's taking place, and I'm curious if did you ever fear for your life? It was something that is very, very, very present in this episode. I wasn't sure if there is any historical. I don't remember of any historical instance where England had assassinated an American foreign.
There's I do not know that England went so far as to succeed through assassination.
Hmm.
I'm certain somewhere in the scope of England's history, you would see it.
England has assassinated. We'll just say that's definitely
Yes,
happened at some point in time.
um,
I meant for
but
in
in
reference
this
to
in
this
this
particular
in this
period.
specific moment in time, there is one account, and I've been waiting to see if and how they undertake it.
Yeah.
There have been several moments where I've wondered if this was the moment. For instance, when the Marquis de Lafayette made his appearance in the Grove, I wondered if that was the account. Or in another instance, when there was a rider coming up, I wondered if that was the account. But while Franklin was in Paris, an individual found their way into the home
Hmm.
and was intercepted before they got to Franklin. I don't remember if I was out at the time or was in another room, but they questioned the individual what they were doing there and uncovered it was indeed a person sent to assassinate
Oh,
Franklin.
I wasn't aware of that. So that is
And
based
so there
in history
it was
there.
there was a fumbled attempt.
Hmm.
Um, it was not done with heightened drama. There was no decoy, uh, and certainly no heightened drama of Franklin being dispatched out of a carriage. I do think there were rumors circulating, similar to how rumors circulated with Lafayette, that I had indeed died,
Mm.
but not with the same drama and stakes that we see demonstrated in the series Franklin.
Right. Okay. Well, that kind of makes sense because it doesn't, given your lax care with your correspondence, and like they even the police say, or the authorities say as much, that not the police, the authorities say as much. Uh, uh, you don't take much care with your comings and goings. I would have been surprised if you were fearful of that kind of move by
No.
your enemies. It wasn't, and correct me if I'm wrong, that kind of uh, secrecy and spycraft and assassinations and those things that are done in Cloak and Dagger were considered pretty ungentlemanly of the era. Being a spy, what Bancroft is doing is incredibly like rude for a gentleman to take. Like, I guess is the right word. It's unbecoming of someone
Yes.
of status. And Bancroft says so much when he's meeting with Lord North in a church of all places. I would be surprised if they.
Very, very much so.
Yeah.
Very much so. And it's punishable by execution. And they make distinction of the ways in which one must be executed. Because if you are a spy, you aren't shot, which is thought to be the gentlemanly
Right.
way to do execution in matters military at this time. You're hanged, as we see with Major John Andre, as we see with Nathaniel Hale. Um, both both parties take part in spycraft, but it's ungentlemanly to take part
Right.
in spycraft.
Yeah. For someone of status, or for some or familial status, it would be uh, uh, not something that you would want to do. But yeah, that's what's remarkable about John Andre, and that's part of the reason why people were so displeased with. We brought him up in one of the previous live streams, Benedict Arnold, and the duplicity is unbecoming of a gentleman, and that's what they expect of you. But in I'm curious if this episode's diving into sort of a fictitious creation where you have your personal goals that feel a little bit separate from the goals of America. Did that add some intrigue to you for in your watching, or as a viewer? I know that it's a difficult viewing since it's your own life, but as a viewer, did that add some intrigue since it was things you didn't know and it was more personal, or does it take away from time better spent on the the
I think
the larger
I think
picture?
I think tension is always more interesting to watch.
Hmm.
Um, I make a remark in a 1789 writing, uh, speaking of the supremacy of the court of the press, that
Okay.
people always derive pleasure from other people's misfortunes or pains. It's
Always.
a
That's
natural inclination, I think, of society. I think this is a curious time in my life. I've spent the whole of a printing career and as a man of science and philosopher and public servant, um, under the guise of climbing and defining myself as a prolific Englishman
hmm.
for the majority of my life. I labored to live a good life in accordance with my values, which were English values. It's simple. I won't undermine it. It is bold and brave for Temple to wish to wage war against England.
Hmm.
It is monumental for someone like myself who has spent over 30 years as an Englishman and discussing retirement in England, living amongst England, having friends in England. And so I wonder if it could have been more interesting to see conflict invited betwixt Mr. Douglas's Franklin of what it means to look back to a lifetime of events that are already monumentalized and deified. Even we see that wonderful portrait of Franklin unveiled, and we
Yeah, the
see
apotheosis of liberty.
and to sit and wonder, well, I have my legacy, I have my fame. What do I deserve to keep for myself
Hmm.
at the end of all of it? Will I live to see the end of this war? Will I live to see an independent America? Not even will I be murdered, will I die of old age before I have the chance to see it? And if I do die of old age, how do I claim for myself whatever vine and fig tree I might obtain?
Hmm.
And I'm certain he's endeavoring to find it in France because he has no way of knowing, will he return to see Philadelphia? Will the entire business miscarry? And so and then of course therein is the great conflict of self-service and public service.
Hmm. Yeah, that is an interesting. It seems like the show is going in a slightly different direction, and not necessarily. I'd be surprised if we get an exploration of that tension within Franklin's character, Michael Douglas's Franklin, and that being very much an Englishman for most of your life, and having to redefine yourself as something other than is something that actually relatively unique amongst the founding fathers. Uh, uh, I don't think any of them spent as much time in England as you did. At least not at least no one comes to mind. Uh,
It's a very kind way of saying I don't know that any of them were as old as you, and they're
well,
probably
that's true.
correct.
Yes,
They're probably correct.
you were
But
the old one in the room. No
I would
offense.
say I would say leading up to the business of our independence, very few amongst I keep moving to say generation, but the fact of the matter is we were all of separate generations. Um, Individuals like James Monroe, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, they were closer to Temple and Lafayette's age than mine. I would say another individual who has not appeared in the series, but alongside Silas Dean, was essential for American diplomacy abroad, was Arthur Lee.
Hmm.
Arthur Lee spent a considerable amount of time in England, seeing to the affairs of the Lee family uh, for the other Lees on the other side of the Atlantic. But I certainly did spend. I was the most American abroad and was the most worldly at home,
Hmm.
which is I think what made me so influential.
That's interesting. We've got a question from the chat that I wanted to get your opinion on. Is William is asking, is there a difference between a spy and a traitor? Or what would be the differentiation between those two things?
Hmm. I think so. I think it's fair. I think we need to first examine what a traitor is in the most legalistic sense. Um, we can examine the trial of Aaron Burr after my death to determine that. But if a traitor is someone who specifically utilizes means to undermine the affairs of a country, um, specifically through warlike measures. And I think there have been many different delineations of what a traitor is over the course of time. I certainly think the differences are plain. Um, this is a curious instance when the term traitor or the idea of treason um, becomes muddied because we were all once of one state,
Hmm.
declaring independence from that state and creating a new sovereign state. So spycraft waged against Great Britain automatically becomes a degree of treason, you
Right.
understand, but no more than declaring independence.
Sure.
No more than conducting affairs for the United States that are adverse to English interest. So I think spycraft for the American cause would deem you a traitor, but it's not the act of spycraft that makes you the traitor.
Okay. Interesting. So it's kind of like how all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares.
We can move to a mathematical sense. I was going to sit and say, I'm a Pennsylvanian
Yeah.
and I'm a printer, just as any other individual may be a Pennsylvanian and adopt a different trade. In this equation, uh, spycraft is to printer, traitor is to Pennsylvanian. I
Okay.
apologize for making the whole of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania traitors in this equation, but you understand, it's just another method whereby you could support the cause of America, or removing it to a larger sense, it's Bancroft
Yeah.
is a spy for Great Britain. Does that then make him a traitor to the cause of America? Absolutely, but he was not an American to begin with.
Right.
He was an Englishman in support of America. Um,
But he's a
so
is
if
he
a
a traitor to the friendship that you have with him?
perhaps the only remark I make upon it in my lifetime is that he might be, but I still like him anyway.
They paraphrase that when they're talking about in the episode. That
Mm,
quote. I actually remembered you bringing that up, and then
mhm.
that's what when Adams is saying, I'm forgetting the gentleman's name. The one who handles all of the military books. Verjean? Verjean?
Yes,
For the court or for the crown. He's saying he's not our friend, but I happen to like him. I still like him anyway. It seems like it was a
yes,
paraphrasing of that particular quote about
yes.
Bancroft, which is I thought was funny.
And so this game becomes very complex. To be a traitor is to turn against yourself, to turn against friends, to turn against a state. And so we might label Bancroft a traitor, but to look at his long acquainted character that I've had with him is Bancroft being untrue to himself.
Mm.
What are the causes behind what is compelling him to do it? And so it's a very curious question. We could have this thought experiment and wax philosophical upon it all day.
Yeah, that is it is very interesting. I guess treason is in the eye of the beholder, at least to a certain extent. There is
I
one
believe
other
I
thing.
believe
Yes,
I
doctor.
was just, I believe it was Dryden who said that.
Oh yeah, yeah. I think you're probably right. There's one other thing that was mentioned that brought up in this episode that hasn't come up at all, which I was curious if it was going to. Religion has not been really mentioned as much. I mean, Michael Douglas's Franklin has made a couple of allusions to God in previous episodes, but there is a very important difference between America and France,
Hmm.
and it was a much bigger deal than I think is being like that we get to see really in the show so far. But it was dealt with a little bit. But could you explain a little bit of the context
I
between
think
Catholicism and
it's fast.
Protestantism at the time
Well,
and
it's fascinating because you say religion was brought up, and I say Catholicism was brought up.
Catholicism? Yeah, yeah, sure.
Um, we live in an age of uh, married factions, and what I mean by that is you see uh, faith and state interwoven in what's called an imperium, a power within a power, a state within a state. The church is involved. Catholicism is somewhat um, different because you have, of course, the Prince of Rome as the head of the church, interweaving nations together. But even in the American colonies, you see state-sponsored religion post-Reformation.
Hmm.
So Pennsylvania, thankfully, has seen the free exercise of religion, of separation of church and state. But you see other provinces lacking in that. You see Massachusetts with a state-sponsored faith. You see Virginia with a state-sponsored faith. Rhode Island has the same free exercise of religion that Philadelphia does. But you see the church interwoven through states, and you see in general because of the Reformation and because of various ecclesiastical wars, a great distrust and prejudice of Catholics.
Hmm.
Certain provinces and certain colonies had it outlawed to be a practicing Catholic within that province. And so one of the shibboleths through which France was distrusted was because it was a papal nation. It was a nation of papists. And so we see that distrust, and we see it. We see particularly with the arrangement of Temple, not only illegitimate in his birth, but of a lower station, but Protestant. We see it in the arrangement of the marriage ties, and
Hmm.
we see it suggested with the young lady's father that certain things must be done if Temple is to marry, meaning the insinuation he must convert.
Convert. Yeah. That's yeah, it's interesting. I think that the interwe I like that your use of the word interweaving, because when we think about the uh, um, way we think about religion today and in this in modern day in 2024, I don't think it's very difficult for us to understand how interwoven religiosity was, even in places with free practicing of religion like Pennsylvania. It was very much a part of life, even if it wasn't a government state sponsored part of your life. It was everywhere. And it mattered a great deal that our ally in this endeavor was going to be a Catholic nation, and there was going to be a Catholic army on
It was a
American shores.
it was a profound difference, a
Yeah,
profound difference. Um, it's a remarkable thing in your time if you can view them all as worshippers of the same God and same faith and slightly different practices. That was not the opinion of the 18th century. There was a gargantuan distrust and prejudice against Catholics.
yeah, and it was the way it's being used in the show. It almost seems as if um, Lady Brion is saying it as the polite way of denying the marriage versus saying, "Hey, you guys come from crap stock. Like you can't marry my daughter because I care about her future." Um, it rather than that being a fundamental breaking point, which it surely would have been. Temple may have been able to convert, which was possible, but
And for her own story, we see her wrestle with her position
hmm,
that as a lady of the time strips her of autonomy and power and agency, and we see her reclaim some of that. I think it's remarkable. Her husband in the previous scene says, "This is my estate. I'm doing it my way," and we see her over the course of the episode demonstrate her agency, her power as lady of the house. Of this will not happen,
yeah.
and I think that a remarkable reclamation in that moment.
Yeah, there's and when the doctor references the agency and for women at the time, married women specifically, it was very more than theoretical. There was a concept, and it's actually a French word called coverture, which in literally is a lack of person. Like a married woman is covered under the legal personhood of her husband. She's legally not an independent person. The best modern comparison is the way a child is not necessarily doesn't have the same legal rights as an adult. They are sort of covered under the legal rights of their parents, what parents can do. But that's kind of the relationship. So when he says that my name is on the house, the estate, he means it because you can't sign a contract. The house could not be in your name. It is not possible. Like I am the only person here. I get to make the choices. But within the household, I thought that was really interesting that that scene takes place inside of their house as opposed to in the garden or something like that, because that's where some women found the ability to exert some agency, like she does at the end of the episode. I thought it was actually that part of it, though the storyline is most likely entirely fictitious. I thought it was relatively well done in exploring some of the dynamics
And
of
I
the
think
era.
you might be able to speak more with your eye for this lens that I'm coming to understand. Uh, but did not Mr. Douglas's Franklin and the husband seem quite small at the close of that scene, with
Oh,
her centered up on the
it
couch.
was.
What a remarkable
I
thing!
laughed out loud at
Like
that thing. It was very funny.
a delightful composition of that moment.
Yeah, there was one other time that they got a visual gag at the very beginning of the episode when there's a discussion taking place about whether the opulence of all of this is going to bankrupt a family, and then they reel back the curtain, and the wig that the wife had 4 or 5 people assembling is probably 4 feet tall. And this is in preparation for the 4th of July. Like, it reminded me of some of the political cartoons of the time. Like, it was
Yeah.
just a caricature of height. There are moments when the show does, I think, visually brilliant visual storytelling, like those 2 scenes. That shot on the couch was very, very good. And even seeing where they were sitting on the Madame Briand is actually closer to her husband than Dr. Franklin on the couch, and they're not split evenly between the 2. Her family is very much on one side of the couch, and Dr. Franklin is sitting and leaning away on the other. So I think they were trying to represent the dynamics of where that relationship is. And I'm curious to see. I'll save it for the future episodes because we're going to see how it all plays out. But I would love to talk about your opinions on your friendship with Madame Briand as it has evolved, because we touched on it a bunch in the earlier live streams in the previous episodes. But I would love to dive into that. But I'm sure we're going to see more of it in the future as I can. But do you have any parting thoughts for the audience, Doctor?
I think we're moving towards a great spectacle that will heighten everything we have seen to this point. Higher stakes, sweeter pleasures, greater pains, and higher and heightened uncertainty. And if that's not life, well, I don't know what is. But I greatly look forward to it. And as always, I'm delightful to speak upon it with you, sir.
Yeah, this was wonderful. I had a great time. And as always, if you really like this conversation and like the cut of the Doctor's jib, please subscribe to his podcast, Let's Be Frank. It's available wherever you get your podcasts. And video versions of the show appear on this very YouTube channel. So like and subscribe. A new video will drop today. Oh, we've got a couple, actually, some last questions in the chat that we can maybe hit one before we go. Alistar Moons said, Ben, do you think the show exposes the roots of the French Revolution? How? What was your reaction to the events unfolding in France following your entering relationship with all of these characters? This is an interesting thought. Do you think we have time to get into it today, or should we save it for the next live stream?
I think this question is only going to become more relevant, and I think it a remarkable one, because I suspect we're going to carry through to the Battle of Yorktown and the aftermath that follows. And I'm eager to see what happens. The simple and short answer to your question is yes. Yes, I do. And we've spoke upon it slightly, I believe it was at the last installment, to speak of France ignoring what is in front of them and what that is inevitably going to lead to. I think, and I hope, in coming installments, we are going to see a France that can no longer ignore it and begin to reconcile with what is about to happen.
Interesting. I'm curious to see how that they do in the show.
I'm curious to see if Mr. Jefferson will make a cameo. I'm curious to see if Lafayette, having put away the soldier, will begin speaking upon French liberty and French rights. But I certainly think we've seen the evidence more than the people in the show have. I'm curious to see if the people in the show will see it before it comes to a close.
Yeah, me too. So, Alistar, stay tuned. Check in for the future live streams so that I'm sure we'll talk more about this shortly in the coming episodes. There are 3 episodes left, I believe, of the series, so we will have 3 more of them, and we're planning something kind of special for the finale. So hopefully everyone here will be able to stick around until then, because we will got something up our sleeve. So, like I was saying before, if you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe to the Doctor's Podcast. Let's Be Frank, available wherever you get your podcasts. And the video version of the show appears on this YouTube channel. And a new episode is dropping. A new video is dropping today. So you can go check that out as soon as we finish. But don't leave right now. And also, if you enjoy any of the content on Primary Source Media, please, if you'd be so moved, feel free to join our Patreon. You can join for free, but also if you want to throw us a few bones, all of the money there goes towards supporting the content that we make on this channel. Not only this live stream, but our other podcasts, and some additional content that we've got planned coming up in the future. And as always, thank you so much, Doctor.
Good day,
We'll see you next week. Take care. Bye, everyone.